On a foggy morning in the winter of 1944, near the frozen wasteland of the Ardennes forest, an eerie silence hung in the air. The distant rumble of artillery, the whistling of shells overhead, and the occasional crack of a rifle in the trees were the only sounds piercing through the bitter cold. The German forces were making their final push in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. German Panzer divisions, massive, roaring behemoths of steel and fire, moved swiftly through the dense forests, threatening to crush the exhausted American defenses. In the heart of this battle, near a small American position, one gunner, just one, would stand between a formidable German assault and the men of his platoon. The weight of the war seemed to rest on the shoulders of this lone soldier, who faced an almost suicidal decision with nothing but his anti-tank gun and his resolve. It was the early hours of the 20th of December 1944, and the scene was set for what would become a desperate stand. Sergeant John Harris, a seasoned gunner with the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, sat in a cold, cramped position behind his anti-tank gun. The terrain was unforgiving, muddy, uneven, and treacherous. The forest around him, once thick with the promise of shelter, now seemed more like a death trap. Harris had been trained for this moment, but no amount of training could have prepared him for the sheer scale of what was about to unfold. As he peered through the sights of his gun, the first German tank appeared, a monstrous Panzer IV, its turret slowly swinging toward the American position. Harris knew that the war's tide had turned, and that each moment was a precious commodity. His orders were clear: hold the line, prevent the enemy from advancing, and do so with any means necessary. But as he crouched behind the gun, his hands steady, the crushing weight of responsibility fell on him. One gunner, one tank, the fate of his platoon hanging in the balance. Harris didn't have the planned luxury of distance. In fact, his position, hidden behind a thick tree line, was less than ideal for an engagement with a German tank that weighed nearly 25 tons, with thick armor that had been designed to withstand almost everything Allied forces could throw at it. But Harris had something the Germans didn't count on: experience, grit, and a deadly knowledge of how to exploit the vulnerabilities of the Panzer's armor. The first round fired by Harris was a clean miss. The gun's recoil slammed him back against the ground, sending vibrations up his spine. But Harris wasn't deterred. The German tank continued its slow, methodical advance, and Harris calculated his next move. The truth of this battle was simple. Harris was in a suicidal position. The distance between him and the tank was a mere 150 yards. A tank shell fired from that range would be enough to obliterate his position and everyone near him. His chances of survival were slim, but the stakes were too high. This gunner had to hold the line, or the Panzer would crush the American position and send the entire division into retreat. The Panzer fired, and the blast echoed through the forest. The ground trembled beneath Harris as the shell whizzed past, missing by mere inches. The blast sent debris flying, the air thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning gunpowder. Harris, eyes wide, adjusted his aim again. He knew the angle at which the German tank was approaching could be his only chance: the suicidal angle, a term coined by the American tank crews and artillery gunners who had learned through bloody experience that it was the only way to target a tank's weak spots. It wasn't the front of the tank where Harris needed to aim. The Panzer's front armor was nearly impenetrable. Instead, he focused on the tank's side, where the armor was thinner. He had to wait for the tank to turn slightly to expose its flank. The Germans, in their confidence, never anticipated this kind of counterattack from such a vulnerable position. For hours, the two forces circled each other in a deadly dance. The tank fired again and again, its heavy rounds tearing up the earth, but Harris remained focused. The minutes stretched into hours, and with each shot that passed him by, the tension in the air grew more unbearable. Harris could hear the crackling radio calls from his comrades, the desperate requests for air support, the orders to retreat, but he held firm. If he moved from his position, if he left that single, exposed anti-tank gun, it would be over. His men would be overrun. Then, finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the German tank shifted, just slightly, exposing its flank. In that brief, fleeting moment, Harris took his shot. He could see the shell leave the barrel of his gun in slow motion. It sailed through the smoke, straight toward the vulnerable side of the Panzer. The explosion was deafening. The tank shuddered violently, its turret swinging wildly as the crew inside scrambled in panic. The blast had torn through the side armor, striking the ammunition stores, and igniting a fiery explosion that sent the Panzer careening out of control. The once mighty war machine, invulnerable in the eyes of many, was now a burning husk, its mission to destroy, halted by the precision of a lone gunner. Harris knew that his shot had made a difference, but the price had been high. His position was compromised. The Germans would undoubtedly retaliate. And yet, for a brief moment, a sense of victory washed over him. The Panzer was no longer a threat, but Harris had only seconds to savor the success before the sound of approaching infantry and artillery reached his ears. The battle, it seemed, was far from over. The Americans, seeing the Panzer disabled, rallied to Harris's position. They moved quickly, pushing forward in an attempt to capitalize on the destruction of the German tank. But Harris's efforts were not without consequence. The weight of the fight was not lost on him. He had done his part, but the war, like the tank that had threatened to crush him, was still very much alive. The battle for the Ardennes continued, and it would take everything they had to survive the coming days. But that cold morning in December, with his heart racing and his hands shaking from adrenaline, Harris had done what many thought impossible. He had held a Panzer at bay for hours, with nothing but a suicidal angle and a single shot. The line had held, and for that moment, Harris would always know the true power of a single gunner's determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The destruction of the Panzer that fateful morning was not just a victory of tactics. It was the result of a series of small, critical decisions made under intense pressure. Sergeant John Harris's lone defense against the advancing German tank was far from a fluke. It was a culmination of years of experience, the culmination of lessons learned from the battlefield, and a deep understanding of the limitations and vulnerabilities of German armored vehicles. For Harris, the battle wasn't over with the explosion of that Panzer. It had only just begun. What the German forces did not realize as they pushed through the Ardennes was that the Americans were prepared for this kind of fight. The U.S. Army, with its increasingly innovative anti-tank tactics and weaponry, had adapted quickly to the shifting nature of warfare. The Germans, despite their early successes, had underestimated the resolve of the Allied forces. In their mind, the superiority of their panzer divisions, backed by years of experience and technological advances, would be enough to crush the Americans. But as the battle raged on, and as Harris's shot proved, the real advantage lay not in the sheer power of the German tanks, but in the adaptability of the men who faced them. The American military was not simply using brute force against the Germans. They were learning, evolving, and applying creative thinking to each engagement. The tactics they had developed in North Africa and Italy had been refined and adapted for the brutal winters of the Ardennes. And it was not just the gunner who needed to be precise. It was every soldier, from the infantrymen to the tank crews, all working in concert, executing strategies designed not just to fight but to outthink the enemy. Sergeant Harris's shot, though a turning point, was just a single piece of the puzzle. His success wasn't only attributed to his marksmanship but to the technology he was armed with. The 57mm M1 anti-tank gun, a relatively small but highly effective weapon that had been developed through trial and error. This gun, capable of piercing the Panzer's thinner side armor, was one of the many innovations that had turned the tide for the Americans. It was a powerful tool in the hands of skilled gunners, but it required expertise, knowledge of the enemy's weak points, the ability to read the terrain, and the courage to face the unimaginable. Harris's use of the suicidal angle was not simply born from desperation. It was a calculated move, a precise recognition of the tank's vulnerability. German tanks like the Panzer IV were formidable, but they had their weaknesses. Their thick frontal armor was designed to deflect most anti-tank shells, but their sides and rear were often more vulnerable. The M1 gun, while not as powerful as the German 75mm guns, was still capable of inflicting damage when used with skill and accuracy. The suicidal angle was a concept born out of necessity, a last resort shot fired at the angle where the side armor met the tracks, where the gun could penetrate and disable the tank. But Harris was not alone in this effort. Across the battlefield, other American gunners, infantrymen, and tank crews were employing similar tactics, taking advantage of the terrain and the momentary openings in the German offensive. Every American soldier knew that survival depended on not just firepower but intelligence, understanding how to exploit the terrain, understanding how to outmaneuver the enemy, and understanding how to use their limited resources in the most effective ways possible. The Germans, as powerful as their armored divisions were increasingly finding themselves outmatched in this regard. The Battle of the Ardennes, which had begun as a bold attempt to break through the American lines, was turning into a costly and bloody affair for the German forces. The Panzer crews, many of whom were well trained and experienced, were facing an enemy that was able to adapt quickly, using not just their firepower, but their minds. As the hours wore on after Harris's successful shot, the battle intensified. The Germans, seeing the destruction of their tank, began to regroup. They sent more panzers into the area, hoping to break the stalemate. But now, they faced more than just American infantry and tanks. They were faced with a well-coordinated defense, one that had learned from its mistakes and adapted in real time. Harris and his fellow gunners were no longer just shooting at tanks. They were creating opportunities, seizing moments, and using everything at their disposal to hold the line. The terrain, too, played a critical role in this newfound strategy. The dense forests of the Ardennes were a perfect hiding place for ambushes, and the frozen ground, while difficult for the advancing German tanks, gave the American forces an advantage in terms of mobility. The Germans, with their heavier tanks, struggled to navigate the narrow, icy roads. The American forces, meanwhile, had adapted their tactics to focus on anti-tank operations, using infantry to target weak points and coordinating artillery and tank fire to cripple the German advance. But it wasn't just the gunners or the tank crews who made a difference in the outcome of the battle. The logistical backbone of the American Army, the engineers, the supply crews, and the radio operators worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that the front lines were supplied with ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The U.S. Army's logistical operations, though often unseen, were critical in ensuring that units like Harris's remained operational despite the onslaught of German fire. As the day wore on, the German assault began to stall. The panzers that had once seemed unstoppable were now facing a well-coordinated defense that refused to break. The Americans, through sheer determination and ingenuity, had turned the tide. The success of Sergeant Harris's shot was symbolic of the broader shift in momentum, one that would continue to unfold over the coming weeks as the Allies began to push the Germans back from the Ardennes. For Harris, the battle was far from over. Though he had dealt a significant blow to the German forces, the fight was not over for him or his comrades. But in that moment, as he reloaded his gun and prepared for the next wave, he knew that his success had bought his men something they hadn't had before. Time. Time to regroup, to fight, and to win. The panzer that had threatened to break his lines was now burning on the battlefield, a symbol of what could be achieved with skill, courage, and a bit of luck. And for Harris, this single engagement, this suicidal angle, this precise shot would become a defining moment in a battle that would soon be remembered as one of the most harrowing and decisive confrontations of the war. The German offensive, once seemingly unstoppable, was now at a standstill, and the American forces, armed with ingenuity and resolve, would begin their counteroffensive in the Ardennes, reclaiming ground that would prove crucial in the days to come. The days following Sergeant Harris's heroic stand marked a critical turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive had been dealt a significant blow, but it was not yet over. The panzers may have been momentarily halted, but they were far from finished. The American forces, emboldened by their small victory, now had to press forward, holding on to the hard-won ground and preparing for the inevitable retaliation. For the German commanders, the loss of a panzer to a single American anti-tank gun was a shock that reverberated through the ranks. They had underestimated the resolve of the American soldiers, believing their heavily armored tanks would easily crush the weaker, less equipped Allied forces. But as more panzers were destroyed in the days following Harris's precise shot, the myth of German invincibility began to unravel. This was a war of attrition, and the Germans were quickly learning that they could no longer depend solely on the raw power of their tanks. The American forces had adapted to their tactics, using speed, stealth, and superior coordination to exploit the vulnerabilities of the German machines. The realization of this shift in momentum did not come quickly for the German high command. At first, they dismissed the loss of a single tank as an unfortunate incident, an isolated failure in an otherwise successful campaign. But as more tanks fell to similar tactics, they realized that their own tactics needed to evolve. The Germans had relied heavily on the psychological advantage their armored divisions gave them. Fear was often as potent a weapon as the tanks themselves. But the Allies had begun to fight back in a way the Germans hadn't anticipated, with intelligence, adaptability, and a fierce determination to win. One of the pivotal moments in this new phase of the battle came on the 23rd of December 1944, when General Patton's Third Army arrived in the Ardennes to relieve the besieged American forces. Patton's men brought with them a new wave of energy, a fresh resolve that was immediately felt on the front lines. But it was not just Patton's reputation or the strength of his army that made the difference. It was the logistical genius that supported him. The Americans had been able to quickly move reinforcements and supplies into the area, exploiting the same roads the Germans had been using for their advance. This swift maneuvering gave the Americans the upper hand in the battle for the Ardennes, allowing them to push the Germans back from key positions. By now, the Americans had perfected the use of their anti-tank weapons, focusing their efforts on exploiting the most vulnerable parts of the German tanks. Harris's tactics were now being echoed across the front, as other gunners used the same suicidal angle to disable panzers. The Germans, struggling to adapt, began to make costly mistakes. They underestimated the importance of maintaining their tank formations and the need for coordination between their armored divisions and infantry. The failure to effectively integrate infantry support with their tanks allowed American infantrymen to take advantage of the gaps in the German lines. On the 25th of December, 1944, the weather in the Ardennes began to shift. The snow and ice that had once created perfect conditions for tank warfare now turned against the Germans. The ground became softer, making it harder for the heavy panzers to maneuver effectively. The Americans, with their lighter and more mobile forces, now had an advantage in the difficult terrain. The Americans were able to flank the German positions, attacking their tanks from the sides, just as Harris had done so successfully days before. In the midst of this shift, the psychological toll on the German soldiers was immense. What had started as an attack full of hope and ambition, the final push to break through the American lines, had turned into a slow, grinding retreat. The realization that they could not simply bulldoze their way through the Americans weighed heavily on the German troops. Disbelief and frustration became common among the ranks, as many soldiers had seen their comrades fall to these seemingly outmatched American forces. This was not the war they had been led to expect. The Americans, it seemed, were no longer the ragtag forces of the early days of the war. They were a formidable fighting machine, able to hold their ground against the best of what the Germans had to offer. The Germans responded with more aggression, launching a series of counterattacks designed to push the Americans back. But the tide had turned. The relentless pursuit of the American forces, bolstered by their superior tactics and newfound confidence, began to erode the German resolve. The Americans had learned not just how to fight the tanks, but how to think like their enemies. They were using the same tools and strategies against the Germans, exploiting their weaknesses and pushing them back with every step. As the days of battle dragged on, it became clear that the German hopes of a decisive breakthrough had crumbled. By January 1945, the Germans had been forced to retreat. What had begun as a bold and ambitious attempt to divide the Allied forces in Western Europe had turned into a devastating defeat. The Americans, with their ability to adapt, had proven themselves capable of outlasting and outthinking the German war machine. The Battle of the Bulge would go down as one of the bloodiest engagements of World War II, but it would also be remembered as the moment when the Allies, against all odds, had turned the tide of the war in the West. For Sergeant Harris, the battle was over, but the war was far from finished. He would go on to fight in other engagements, his reputation as a precise and deadly gunner solidified. But it was that moment in the Ardennes, when a single gunner held the line against a German Panzer, that would define his role in the larger narrative of the war. The suicidal angle he had mastered was not just a tactic, it was a symbol of the determination, creativity, and grit that would carry the American forces to victory. As the war continued, Harris's actions in the Ardennes became a part of the larger story of American resilience. His stand against the Panzer represented more than just a tactical success, it was a reflection of the heart and soul of the American soldier. The victory at the Ardennes, made possible by the courage of men like Harris, would eventually lead to the final collapse of Nazi Germany. And while the gunner's suicidal angle had held off a single tank that day, it also represented the strategy, adaptability, and indomitable will that would ultimately defeat the Nazi war machine. In the years to come, Harris would reflect on the battle, on the moment when everything hung in the balance. His shot that morning was more than just a moment of precision, it was the beginning of the end for the German offensive. And it was a testament to the fact that, in war, the greatest weapon was not just the firepower of a tank or the strength of artillery. It was the human will to hold the line, even when all seemed lost.